Hi, I'm Alice, and I work here at Cambridge University Press Bookshop. As part of our events for Pride this year, and on behalf of the University Press, I'd like to welcome Phillip Ayoub and Douglas Page to talk about their recent paper, Pride Amid Prejudice, the influence of LGBT+ rights activism on a socially conservative society. I'll hand over now to Phillip and Douglas to introduce their paper and talk about their findings.
I'm Phillip Ayoub. I'm an associate professor of diplomacy and world affairs at Occidental College, and I work on LGBTI politics in the European region. And I'm really happy to be here today at the invitation of the Cambridge University Press Bookshop to talk with my co-author, Douglas Page, about a paper that we wrote with another great co-author, Sam Witt, who couldn't be with us today. But the paper is quite fitting for this event in that it's a paper that specifically looks at the effects of a Pride event in the city of Sarajevo. And it's a study that is interesting because it's the first of its kind to look systematically using a kind of experimental design to looking at what are the effects on public opinion of an event like this. So we thought for this Pride Month celebration, it would be useful to present it for this event, and it's the recording that I prepared that you will watch after this introduction. I wanted to start though now by just introducing the event to provide a little bit of historical context about what is Pride, and this is the 51st anniversary of the first Pride March, which at the time in 1970 commemorated the 1969 riots against police brutality at New York City's Stonewall Inn. And this first demonstration really ushered in a new generation of LGBTQ activism called gay liberation, and it was defined by its visibility and this notion that coming out and coming into the streets could transform the lived experiences of queer people as well as the lives of people around them. And the innovation spread to, within a few short years, actually spread to multiple countries. In Germany, where I'm based right now, these events are called Christopher Street Days, which is actually an homage to the street where the Stonewall Inn is located. And despite their different manifestations, these events, these Pride events have become an enduring fixture of LGBTQ visibility, identity, and community. That said, we still don't fully know how these movement performances affect social tolerance and political participation by ordinary citizens. And this is part of our endeavor here because, we can look at this a couple different ways. One, if we look around us, we could say that 50 years on, the world looks markedly different in many ways for queer people. There's maybe no transnationally circulating social issue that has provoked such rapid and transformative favorable change, yet at the same time, these struggles continue almost everywhere in the world. And especially, we should note that the struggle is intense for most populations in the world, since governments that fail to protect or actively discriminate against LGBTQ people represent most of the world's population, and backlash continues to be pervasive to these kind of events. So it's still an open question, what are the effects of events like this? What happens after we celebrate Pride? And we thought that this, first ever Pride event in Bosnia and Herzegovina would be a really special opportunity to look at this, given the, fantastic work that organizers there were doing to host this event. And I will now turn it over to my co-author, Douglas Page, who will provide a bit of context about the origins of the project and the Pride.
Yeah, thank you very much, Phil. So I'm Douglas Page. I'm a visiting assistant professor at Gettysburg College, and I was happy to collaborate with Phil and Sam on this project. So Bosnian activists announced the Pride in the spring of 2019, and we saw this as an opportunity to examine the effects of a new Pride event on the community where it takes place. And Bosnia is a socially conservative society, so according to the recent wave of the World Values Survey, it's the third most conservative country in Europe regarding tolerance of homosexuality, behind Armenia and Georgia. And in the past, other LGBT events in Bosnia have faced protests and attacks. But the Pride organizers saw these factors as motivations to mobilize and raise support and awareness. And the Pride took place on September 8th, 2019, with 3,000 marchers participating. And the hope of the organizers was to start the process of breaking down the prejudice against the LGBT community. So we were excited to set up a research design that could try to evaluate the efforts of the activist community. We collected public opinion data before and after the Pride, and we were happy that the results were primarily positive for their efforts.
So we will now turn it over to the event, over to the recording, and we will check back in at the end.
Šta ti misliš o ovome što se dešava u Sarajevu i šta imaš da kažeš o prvoj gej paradi u Bosni i Hercegovini? Nešto što je najcrnije moglo da budi u ovom oazi prvog vijeka. To je sramno i stidno. Kako se to ovdje gleda u ovom Sauču? Kako se gleda? Nikako, grozno, podano. Suvišno, to nikad niko ovdje nije podržavao, ni bi podržao. Niko neće odbili. Uništavanje androzije, zato što je šteta, a sve više i više na ovim prostorima. Zato što se rasprašuje i zato je to osada i uništenje. Više nema. Korov.
Okay, so you can see kind of from that video, from this man's reaction to the idea of Pride coming to society, it's portrayed as kind of a foreign imposition. It's definitely something portrayed as not welcome, and it really also symbolizes how hard this work is for Pride activists. It's not at all a done deal that having one of these Prides will lead to this this positive change, or that it can come without opposition. So it is that question around, you know, what happens when we have a Pride that leads to our question, which is we just want to know about what are its outcomes in terms of, you know, social tolerance and political participation. Does Pride, does it generate support for LGBT people and activism on their behalf? And we look at it in two different ways. In the part of the study that I'm going to talk about here today, we look at changes in attitudes in terms of supporting LGBT activism. We also look at kind of behavioral change in terms of willingness to participate or financially support such activism as well, and I'll mention it. And one of the motivations here, beyond the debate in the LGBT politics literature, is also a literature from contentious politics scholarship. And actually one of my mentors, Sarah Soul, had put this on the radar for me a couple years ago, and it was a couple of new review articles that came out in 2019 and 2018 by leading contentious politics scholars that said that we still have too much difficulty isolating the effects of social movement performances on opinion and behavioral change, so that the field has devoted really little systematic effort to accounting for the impact of advocacy on the communities and where it takes place. And we thought that, you know, a first Pride like this might provide an opportunity to try to isolate some of that. Furthermore, there is an active debate in the literature of scholars working at LGBT rights. Many scholars in that literature see prides as a necessary and defining element of social justice activism on behalf of LGBT people. So ideally, they expect that an event like this could boost social tolerance for LGBT communities, consistent with research on the contact hypothesis, which posits that direct or indirect interactions with outgroups can reduce prejudice. And that you know, prides are front and center in that regard in making LGBT people visible and responding to opponent groups, capturing hearts and minds, and mobilizing sustained participation. They also draw, they're also an international repertoire of this movement's activism, so they draw a lot of international attention, like you can see in that picture from a couple months ago, with European parliamentarians supporting LGBT rights to draw attention on repression in Poland, but that these prides, they draw this kind of international attention, which can also channel resources, bring participants. IOs and embassies use pride as a way of supporting a local movement to entrench it as part of human rights discourses, and they can also, attract media attention to those events, and that's also important for shifting a domestic discourse on how you talk about LGBT people, because sometimes local media don't yet know the language of how to talk about LGBT communities in a new way, and when you have international press, reporting on the same event in a very different tone, it can change also the language around these events. At the same time, there's a really compelling literature that also really highlights, some serious side effects that can come from prides, and it draws attention to resentment or backlash towards LGBT people in socially conservative societies when you have a pride, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that pride, as I explained earlier, is an innovation that comes from Western democracies with established movement and protest cultures, and there's a concern that it will feel locally and culturally insensitive to have them in certain places, and also a concern that it feeds into the narrative that queer people are foreign, that its ideas coming from somewhere else when you talk about these identities and with a movement tactic that has developed in the West. So as such, queer theorists actually argue that pride can sometimes, or not all queer theorists, but some, that pride can also paradoxically make LGBT people invisible, in the sense that it paints them as part of foreign Western influence that is antithetical to local societies. And then furthermore, pride can have other side effects, such as including heightened repression by drawing public attention around toward LGBT people that can reinsert, discourses around LGBT people as these problematic discourses around LGBT people being unnatural or foreign or sinful, or a threat to national identity, the traditional family, religious values, etc. So there is this rich debate there, and this rich debate, I think we want to acknowledge that it exists for a reason, because this kind of activism is complex and we have to think about it carefully. And it is that complexity that we try to tease out a little bit in the argument, where we want to draw some mechanisms from both of these schools to theorize that the effects of pride, they're interactive and they might operate in different ways across geography and social groups. So we argue that prides should work to influence their communities by raising awareness of LGBT people and, potentially shifting cultural norms through this original celebration of queer life that legitimizes LGBT people's presence in the public space. And later I'll show you one other short clip where people also activists talk about that importance of being in the public space. Yet we want to acknowledge that these effects may not be uniform across society, varying in reach according to a person's proximity to the event itself and contact with LGBT social networks. So that means that the pride's effects might be more limited to its locality, and similar to other earlier debates on visibility politics, it means that the visibility, the felt intensity of that visibility might be different across time and space. And beyond this, we also note that different people might react differently to the pride and see it as threatening or unthreatening to different degrees. And here we have work from earlier research that really underscores how religiosity and nationalism or ethno-nationalism play an important role in explaining who attributes threat to LGBT movements. And the reason why, from feminist and queer scholarship, the reason why movements around gender and sexuality can be threatening is because they're very fluid concepts, and they can be particularly threatening to people who hold on to very fixed concepts like national identity or religious tradition, where the movements advocating for rights of women and LGBT people can seem to destabilize that, and that provokes sometimes the most active mobilized resistance. So we might also expect that different people with different degrees of attachment to the nation or religious communities might respond differently to the same Pride event than other people in their societies. So that leads us to a couple hypotheses. The ones that I'll talk about today are hypothesis one, which is that prides should increase support for LGBT activism. However, again, this effect might be circumscribed, that prides will have the greatest effect on individuals in close proximity to the event. We also ran 2 survey experiments and a behavioral experiment where we primed people about their willingness to participate if they were reached out by a pro or anti-LGBT activist. And we also had this dictator game looking at hypothetical funding allocations, and I'm happy to address both of those in the Q&A and also show you those results if you're interested later. So let me talk about case selection now. We test these hypotheses in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which we define as a socially conservative society. And that definition, I mean, that's a very tricky definition, but because of course we have all sorts of states that are conservative, including, ones where there is some LGBT level of progress, but our definition looks at particularly attitudes where there's high levels of homo and transphobia, and also where LGBT communities are still relatively new in the domestic discourse. So you can see here from the chart that over 80% of Bosnians feel that homosexuality is never justifiable. Also from another survey, 77% of respondents reported having 0 feelings of closeness toward LGBT people, and that's on a scale of 0 to 10. So it does display quite, conservative attitudes towards LGBT populations. Furthermore, Bosnia is we think of it as a hard case because it's a post-conflict society with heightened conditions of ethnic nationalism and religiosity that, as I pointed out before, scholars theorize would correspond with low levels of LGBT support. And that's based, of course, on divisions also between Muslim Bosniaks, Orthodox Serbs, and Catholic Croats, so different sets of strong identities. And then finally, Bosnia is also interesting because it's seeking broader integration into the European Union, which is, on the other hand, advocating for LGBT rights as part of European values. So activists were really having to plan a lot for this event and confronting a lot. And so they did it quite carefully with some interesting frames. The main frame was "we want to come out," which, even though that has quite a lot of international resonance with the movement, they also used it the way at least activists explained it to me. It was a play on words for what you yell at the driver when you want to get off the bus. And they also wanted to make sure that the march was local, and so even though it was supported by some embassies and international guests came, it wanted to make sure that local people and organizers were front and center. It was also framed as the BIH, or the Bosnia and Herzegovina Pride, instead of the Sarajevo Pride, because they really wanted it to have a national resonance. And this is something I'll talk about later. They also wanted it to feel like a protest and not a celebration, so it looked very different than the CSD that you would have in Berlin. It really felt like a political demonstration. And one of the other main frames, of course, was the LGBT rights are part of human rights, really wanting to address discrimination. 3,000 people marched, that's a lot of people in comparative perspective at an event like this for a first event, and also 1,000 police protected it or were there. And one of the organizers gave a really moving speech at the event, and I'll read just a very short excerpt from it that gives some context. She said, "We are aware that this first march will not change the world, and we are aware that there are many LGBTIQ persons who, even after it ends, will not be able to tell the people closest to them who they really are. But we know that this march, this struggle, will give them the strength and hope that change can happen. This march gives us strength and faith that it will start the process of breaking prejudice against us. We are here, we exist, and we are not a threat to anyone. We are part of society, and we have the right to be equal citizens." So this was, I think one of the main themes that brings the goals of this march to light. And you can see on the map there that it ran right through the center of the city. So to examine the effects of Pride, we use this pre-post treatment design. We had nationwide cross-sectional surveys and a local panel survey before and after the Pride took place. And the survey question that I'll be focusing on as the dependent variable in this part or in this talk looks at on a scale of 1 to 4 from strongly opposed to strongly support LGBT activism. And these surveys were done actually with the main survey firm Ipsos, who helped us. They helped us conduct this. And then we have these survey experiments and the behavioral experiment, which I mentioned before. But then after this, we also followed up with 6 post-treatment interviews with key activists. And this builds off, I spent a lot of time in the field for my book where we had, where I had many interviews in Europe with activists, and including addressing some of the same themes. But we wanted to have these post-treatment interviews to really dissect kind of the mechanisms behind the correlations that we uncovered here, and I'll try to provide you some context also after showing you some of the results based on what activists had to say about their own perceptions of the effect of Pride. And so here's one of the figures from the paper. I'm just going to show you 2. But I have all the others and also several from the appendix in the back that we can go to during the Q&A. But this figure I like a lot because what you see here, I think it's quite interesting that we see little or no movement in public opinion outside of Sarajevo. So if you look on, I think on your right on those 2 clusters of bar graphs there, you see the opposition remains largely unchanged at about 64–65% strongly opposed to LGBT activism. However, inside Sarajevo, you see a near 10% drop in strong opposition from before to after the Pride, which really suggests that Pride had a positive impact on reducing opposition and raising support for LGBT activism, but only mainly in proximity to where it took place. And actually more symbolically, if you add together the strongly support and somewhat support, it also, technically flipped public opinion to the in favor camp above 50%. After the Pride. So overall, consistent with hypothesis 1, we do find evidence of a Pride effect for increasing LGBT or increasing support for LGBT activism, but the effect appears to be limited to those within the proximity of the Pride itself, as predicted by hypothesis 2. Here also, I'll show you, some of the additional controls, and you can see here that the interaction term Pride treatment times Sarajevo is robust to extended controls. And then you can also see that we have this index for LGBT contact and support, which is an index measuring, a closeness to LGBT people, contact with them. This also has an independent effect on support for activism, as does being aware of the Pride. Furthermore, we see that if you support the EU, which means you might be less attached to, somewhat less attached to national identity, that you also see a significant effect as theorized, signaling that you might be more supportive of LGBT rights. In the opposite direction of how someone would feel that's more attached to the nation. People who identify as Bosniak, Serbs, and to a lesser degree Croats are also less supportive of LGBT activism than those who assume the superordinate identity of Bosnian. And that again makes sense, that the more attached you are to ethno-nationalism and also religiosity, the less likely you might be to support Pride. In the survey experiments, which I'm not showing, we find, just briefly, we find that there is also a willingness to attend and even financially underwrite these events after Pride. So why is this why is this happening, or why, at least in the proximity part of the argument, why do we see this? So we wanted to validate with these interviews, and it was very interesting that these organizers really also emphasized a mechanism of change rooted in contact with LGBT communities, and they really felt that Pride compelled ordinary Bosnians to recognize LGBT people, and especially among those without strong negative priors, that they were able to positively be swayed by depictions of LGBT minorities during Pride. And one activist described how people had the opportunity to quote unquote see us and were confronted by the fact that some of their stereotypes didn't hold. So overall, they felt it portrayed a positive picture of the community. At the same time, it was also interesting that many activists qualified the effects themselves and alluded to proximity. One activist said, Pride had an especially positive impact on those that were physically closer to it. People in Sarajevo region were confronted with it and compelled to form an opinion on it compared to others. So even though it was called Bosnia and Herzegovina Pride, it was de facto Sarajevo Pride, because people outside of it could go on with their lives without dealing with it in the same way. So the mechanisms behind this proximity that kind of came up in the interviews were as follows. One is quite, most, I guess, obviously, is just being able to interact with or see the march. And you can see that in these photos here, that there is this kind of interaction between people along the parade or the march route. Next, activists also talked about the disruption that the shutting down of the city around the march route caused, which they actually saw in a positive way, because they really emphasized that you couldn't go about your life or even move around to go to work or whatever without confronting or thinking about the Pride, which meant that they said everybody talked about it. You had to talk about it in Sarajevo at the dinner table. Then you kind of found out, oh, maybe your neighbor's going, or maybe one of your kids thinks it's actually okay to go or whatever. And it created these conversations that people were constantly confronted with it in Sarajevo. Next, there's also this interesting dynamic, is that people only became visible during the march itself, due also to kind of the tactics of how these marches are organized, in that because of fear of violence towards people, the organizers specifically said that people should not don or wear any kind of rainbow flag or any kind of symbols that might connect them to the march until they got there to the route themselves, when they had, the kind of protection of the route, and that once the march was over, that those kind of that kind of clothing should be removed, that it wasn't visible. Again, this had to do with safety protections, but in a way invisibilized people that were then going back to other parts of the country, etc., once they left the center of the city. And then finally, also, the media came up again, that the quantity of media coverage varied between the national media being less than the media in Sarajevo, but then also that the quality of it changed, that the further you got away from the event itself, there was more speculation and also more talk about traditional values, etc. So I think I still have, since I have a couple minutes, I just wanted to, I want to show you two more clips. One talks about the connection of LGBT rights to the EU, and then the other about seeing LGBT people in the public space. And after that, I'll just sum up the main points, and we can open the Q&A.
To je tolerancija, demokracija je. Da li bi vam smetalo da vam je član porodice gej? Da li bi vam smetalo da vam je neko iz uže ili šire porodice gej? Da. Svako bi ga odmah. Da ti je gej neko tvoj. Ne mogu se presuditi.
This is now an activist.
Što je naravno jedna pogrešna nam šalje poruku da smo mi tu, da smo mi rođeni tu i da ono kao ne želimo da idemo ili se vraćamo ovdje da dokažemo da smo ono kao mi objekt, da mi postojimo u Bosansko-Hercegovačkom društvu.
To je bila jedna provala slobode, jedan
Okay, so let me go ahead and just wrap up. So this study was the first to assess the effects of LGBT pride activism using a pre-post treatment design. And well, I've kind of simplified things a little bit for the sake of the argument. We can go into more detail in the Q&A, but we want to provide evidence that prides, or we do provide evidence that prides are successful in raising LGBT plus awareness, support, and mobilization potential. Overall, prides do seem to be able to heighten the visibility that validates LGBT identity development, even in a quite hard case. And you know, one activist really pointed out that the importance of first prides was that people who are worried about it can wake up the next day and see that, you know, it's maybe not that threatening after all. And as this one activist said, it's always a struggle to have a first pride, but then it happens and people wake up in the morning and find out that life has not changed. Purity in society has not been overthrown. The leaders of the church are still the leaders of the church. That's why pride matters, or that's why first prides matter. At the same time, we did recognize this important scope condition regarding that prides can, in terms of what they can substantively do to shift public opinion in a conservative society, and this is due to pride facilitating contact with LGBT people in its proximity, which could be more effective at allaying negative stereotypes of participants than in further removed contexts where movement demands might become diluted or invisible. Also, important, while prides may yield potential rewards, they carry a lot of serious risk, and this is something that organizers really talk about and that we really felt from that aspect of the research, that and that's also true of many other societies in Europe and around the world. So for LGBT movements, you know, security remains a major issue for prides and their participants, which places an important ethical constraint also on when organizers might see them as appropriate. Next, one interesting thing that I just wanted to point out, because this connects a little bit to a theme that came up in the interviews and other work, that while we say that proximity matters a lot for public visibility, that means visibility with broader society, I found it really interesting that interpersonal visibility, or this idea that visibility among queer people, that seemed to travel a lot further, and we didn't really test this specifically, so I can't really speak to it with the data outside of the interviews. But one activist, you know, said, we received a lot of messages from LGBT people from smaller communities and towns saying that pride gave them hope to carry on. And for this activist, that empowerment is the most important. So it's not just, you know, pride is about reaching out to broader society, but it's also about being there for queer people themselves, and it really seemed like this, you know, those communities were paying attention and were aware that this was happening and it was meaningful to them, and that's a theme that, you know, we could trace back to to much earlier times in how queer people built community, and in many different places. So I will stop talking now, but thank you very much for your attention. We want to thank you for watching this event, and we hope you enjoyed the presentation. And I just thought, you know, to close it, we wanted to reflect a little bit on kind of how we've been thinking about the study in its aftermath. And for one, I mean, this study was an interesting project for us to wrap up during a pandemic, because the isolation that all of us have felt and how we are now on our computer screens is really different than the kind of interaction that we emphasize in this grassroots local event that was so inspiring, even though this project was still inspiring for us to work on during the pandemic, because we got to continue to engage with organizers and also got to work on a really, inspiring project for us. But one of the things that we thought to take away from it, and this goes in line with a lot of, different thinking that many commentators have also chimed in on in recent months, is what can we learn from this period of, pandemic era life? And I think that the paper does actually, or the findings of this study, which happened shortly before the pandemic started, suggest, really maybe it's okay to kind of reset and think about how we can move forward with Pride and Pride celebrations in the future after this isolated era. And I think that one of the takeaways from the paper is really this locality and this, the political fervor of a really grassroots demonstration, as opposed to kind of a commercial float-like Pride, might have some nuggets of value for us in thinking about how we navigate our politics in terms of making them the most transformative. And I think there are important open questions about how we make prides more inclusive, of communities that are often left out, of people of color, more inclusive around gender and gender identity, and thinking about hard questions about, police marching in prides, given what this means for some communities who are marginalized by police brutality. Those are kind of questions that I think we should think about with openness to reform how we're doing things, and going back to the start of the original kind of local, really grassroots event that started all of this. And so we felt, that might be a nice kind of forward-looking way or note to end on. Douglas?
Yeah, or fingers crossed, we'll be collecting some follow-up data later this year, and we'll be able to keep you all in the loop with our findings and how public opinion is changing or not since the event in 2019. So that'll be exciting for us to do. And also, important implication from our study is that we want to encourage you all to investigate, to look up, to explore the local LGBT activism that's going on in your community, and make sure to show up for those folks, because we believe that it's going to have a positive effect. And before we hit the road, we'd like to once again thank the Cambridge University Bookshop for all of their help in this.
Yes, and we are here to answer your questions. That was, the one downside of not having an in-person event, is that we can't answer them in real time, but please do reach out to us at the contact information provided in the YouTube link, and Douglas and I will get back to you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.